A Kingdom on Edge, England, in 1531. The year was 1531, and England was a nation bracing for upheaval. Though outwardly serene, the country was caught in the storm of one man's desires, in the shifting tectonics of power. That man, of course, was King Henry VIII. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and wed Anne Boleyn was more than a personal matter, it was a political earthquake. The effects rippled through every level of English society, from the nobility and the church to commoners and servants. It created factions. It sowed distrust. It created heroes and martyrs, but more often it made scapegoats. Among these was Richard Roose. To understand the boiling of Roose's body, we must first understand the boiling political climate of Henry's court. The execution of a cook was not merely the outcome of a murder investigation. It was a symbol, an act designed to send a message. To poison was not only to kill a person, but to subvert divine order, to undermine the social hierarchy, and ultimately to challenge the authority of the king himself. In a kingdom where power was centralized under an unpredictable monarch, this perceived challenge had to be met with unrelenting cruelty. The stakes were too high for subtlety, and thus the fate of one cook became inseparable from the fate of a kingdom. Henry VIII, more than a king, a living god. Henry wasn't just a ruler, he positioned himself as divinely appointed God's chosen instrument. His will was to be interpreted as law, and his morality as truth. The decision to pursue Anne Boleyn, breaking from his long marriage with Queen Catherine, was opposed not just by religious traditionalists, but by political loyalists who feared the chaos of alienating the Pope and the Emperor. The Pope's refusal to grant the annulment was more than a denial. It was a challenge to Henry's divine authority. Bishop John Fisher, one of the staunchest defenders of Catherine's position, represented the religious and moral backbone of that resistance. And so when Fisher was allegedly targeted by poisoning, Henry saw it not only as an attempted murder, but as an existential threat, a reminder that rebellion could come in any form, even from a kitchen. Richard Roose, Fisher's cook, was no highborn traitor. He was by most accounts ordinary, and perhaps that is what made his act, or what was perceived as his act, so frightening. It showed that treachery could come from below. It proved that even the lowest rung of society could disrupt the order of things. And to Henry VIII, that was unforgivable. Fear as a tool of statecraft. Fear was central to Henry's rule. He didn't just enforce obedience, he manufactured dread. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that awe and terror were two sides of the same coin. Executions weren't merely punishments, they were performances. They were visual proof of the consequences of dissent. When Henry pushed for the execution of Richard Roose by boiling, it wasn't because that was the only available punishment. It was because it had never been done like this before. There was no legal precedent. Parliament had never passed a law prescribing such a fate, but the law could be made to fit the punishment. The king would see to that. In this way, Roose's boiling was more than an end. It was a beginning of a new kind of terror, one in which the body was used as a canvas for state messaging. It was a signal: this is what happens when you tamper with the sanctified body of the ruling class. This is what happens when you threaten the divine hierarchy. Commentary: modern parallels of manufactured fear. The use of state terror to enforce conformity is not unique to the Tudors. In modern times, authoritarian regimes often leverage public punishments, scapegoating, and retroactive laws to consolidate control. Stalin's show trials. North Korea's brutal purges and even modern surveillance states echoed the same principle. If the state can make an example of one, it can command the obedience of many. What made Henry VIII unique was his theatricality. Every gesture had spectacle. Every punishment was laced with symbolism. And in boiling a man alive, he transformed an execution into myth, a gruesome tale told for generations to remind subjects of the king's unyielding authority. But myth-making is a double-edged sword. The same story that enforces fear can also provoke moral outrage. Over time, what once inspired obedience might instead inspire disgust. And that's part of why the story of Richard Roose still haunts us. It represents the moment when power and paranoia crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The invisible men of power in every grand household of the Tudor period, from noble estates to episcopal palaces. There was a hidden world beneath the grandeur, a hierarchy of servants that made elite life possible. Cooks, chambermaids, footmen, grooms. These were the invisible cogs in the machinery of privilege. and among them Richard Roose lived and worked tucked into the shadows of Bishop John Fisher's residence in Lambeth. Roose was no villain by appearance. He was a middle-aged man, discreet, capable, and largely unnoticed traits prized in a servant. In the rigidly stratified society of 16th century England, a cook's job carried weight. He prepared what the master ate, and that meant an unspoken trust. The cook, after all, was the final gatekeeper between food and mouth. That Roose held such a role in a bishop's home meant he had proven himself valuable, if not exemplary. Yet therein lies the irony. His very proximity to power made him vulnerable. Servants often bore witness to conversations, habits, secrets. And though they had little real agency, their knowledge made them dangerous. In a time of rising paranoia, even a cook could be seen as a potential conspirator. And in Roose's case, he would become the embodiment of that fear. The Tudor kitchen were a world of heat and hierarchy. To understand Roose's life, one must understand the kitchen he worked in. Tudor kitchens were sweltering, chaotic domains loud with clanging pots and bustling with activity. Fires were always burning, cauldrons bubbling, meat roasting. The air was thick with smoke, the floors slick with grease. Each kitchen had its hierarchy: the head cook, undercooks, scullions, and porters. Roose likely occupied a mid-level role, trusted enough to oversee certain dishes, like the infamous soup on February 18, 1531. Food at the time was both sustenance and social display. Dishes were spiced extravagantly, not just for flavor, but for status. Presentation mattered. And in religious homes like Fisher's, meals also had ceremonial weight. Feeding a guest was a gesture of hospitality, of piety. Poisoning that meal then was a desecration as much as a crime. Whether Roose added the powder out of mischief, as he later claimed, or with more malicious intent, the act was catastrophic. The kitchen, a place meant to nourish, became a place of death. And Roose, once invisible, became all too visible. February 18, 1531, a meal turns deadly. It was an ordinary winter afternoon in Lambeth, and inside Bishop Fisher's residence preparations were underway for a modest banquet. The kitchen was alive with activity. Meats simmered, loaves were sliced, and spices were mixed with practiced precision. At the heart of the menu was a pottage, a thick stew common in Tudor England. It was simple, hearty fare made to nourish and fill. Richard Roose had likely prepared this dish countless times. On that fateful day, however, something changed. As he stirred the pot, he added a foreign substance, a powder he would later claim was a purgative, a remedy meant to cleanse the bowels. Whether this act was a foolish joke, an error, or a deliberate poisoning remains unclear. But the consequences would be catastrophic. The guests and the beggars, Bishop Fisher, known for his austerity and piety, hosted a group of guests that afternoon. Some were local clergy, others were devout laymen. As per custom, the meal's leftovers were not wasted. Servants gathered them into simple wooden bowls and distributed them to beggars waiting outside the gate, an act of Christian charity that turned tragically ironic. Two of the poor souls who received the soup that day were Bennet Kerwin and Alice Tripp. Grateful and unaware, they consumed their portions eagerly. Within hours, the agony began. Intense stomach pain, vomiting, cold sweats, and convulsions took hold of those who had eaten. Panic spread. Two of the bishop's guests were severely ill. Kerwin and Tripp would not survive the night. Fisher himself was spared, perhaps by chance, perhaps by divine providence. He had eaten only a spoonful. Contamination or conspiracy? The immediate assumption in Tudor England was not accident, but foul play. Poisoning was viewed as an unholy form of murder, cowardly, secretive, and akin to sorcery. Fear spread through the bishop's household. Who could have done this? Why target the guests of a man already living under political and spiritual scrutiny? Within hours, suspicion turned inward. Roose the cook had disappeared. His sudden absence did not look like fear, it looked like guilt. Flight and capture. Roose attempted to flee London. Where he hoped to go is unknown, perhaps out of the country, perhaps into the anonymity of the countryside. But he never got far. A manhunt was launched, and within a day he was captured and brought to the Tower of London. The Tower was not just a prison, it was a psychological weapon. Inside its stone walls, fear was amplified by isolation. Roose was subjected to torture on the rack, his body stretched until the tendons strained and dislocated. Under extreme duress, he confessed, yes, he had added the powder, but he insisted it was not poison, merely a laxative meant to cause discomfort. It was a weak defense. In the eyes of the court and of Henry VIII, his guilt was already determined. The powder itself, a historical curiosity. Modern historians have speculated on what Roose might have used. Some believe it was arsenic, others suggest a compound derived from poisonous herbs, such as hemlock or monkshood. At the time, the science of toxicology was virtually non-existent. People relied on folk knowledge and superstition. Even if Roose genuinely thought the powder was harmless, the outcome was lethal, and the crown was not interested in subtleties. To Henry, the point was not whether Roose intended to kill it, was that he could have. Commentary: food trust and control. The idea that trust can be broken through something as intimate as a meal is one of the deepest human fears. Food is nourishment, but also vulnerability. To eat is to open oneself to risk. This incident then wasn't just about a failed prank or an attempted murder. It was about the collapsing boundaries between servant and master, between trusted rituals and unseen threats. In a time when so much authority was derived from ritual and order, Roose's actions, intentional or not, undermined the very framework of elite security. And that is why in Henry's eyes, boiling wasn't just justified, it was necessary. The ripple effect of rumor was of the poisoning spread like wildfire through London. In taverns, churches, and marketplaces, people whispered the story: a bishop nearly assassinated, beggars dead, and a cook on the run. In Tudor England, where public information moved slowly, rumor filled the gaps, and rumor was often more dangerous than truth. The narrative evolved quickly. Was it a botched assassination attempt orchestrated by religious radicals? Was Roose a pawn in a larger plot to kill Fisher, perhaps even a tool of Anne Boleyn's faction? Or was this just a cruel joke gone horribly wrong? With each retelling, Richard Roose's guilt became more certain and his punishment more anticipated. Henry VIII's outrage. Despite their differences, Henry VIII saw the attack on Bishop Fisher as a direct affront to royal order. If a bishop could be poisoned, so could a king. Henry's fear of assassination was not new. His obsession with loyalty and betrayal had deep roots, and Roose's case tapped directly into it. The monarch's response was swift and personal. Henry didn't leave the matter to the courts. Instead, he went before Parliament to personally describe the crime and recommend a new law. Poisoning, he argued, was a coward's crime, one deserving of a punishment unlike any other. Parliament obliged. The law is written backwards, the Act of 22. Henry VIII, Chapter 9 passed in a matter of days. It classified poisoning as high treason and established boiling alive as the official punishment. This was a retroactive law designed specifically to ensure Roose would face this gruesome fate. In today's legal frameworks, retroactive laws are considered unjust. A person cannot be punished under a law that did not exist at the time of their alleged crime. But Henry VIII's England followed a different logic. The king's will was the law, and Roose's punishment was not about fairness, it was about control. Commentary: justice or performance. Was Roose's punishment about deterring crime or about putting on a show? Historians continue to debate whether Henry acted from genuine fear or political theater. One school of thought suggests Henry wanted to silence conspiracy theories that Anne Boleyn's faction was behind the poisoning. By swiftly condemning Roose, the king closed the book before deeper questions could be asked. Another theory is simpler. Henry wanted to appear strong. In a moment of national uncertainty, with the church in crisis and the royal marriage unresolved, he needed to project absolute authority. Whatever the reason, boiling Roose alive was a message, not just to the nobility, not just to the clergy, but to every servant, every citizen. There is no room for error, and no mercy for those who breach trust. Public response: morbid curiosity and unease. As the date of Roose's execution neared, the streets buzzed with anticipation. Smithfield, the site chosen for the act, had long hosted public executions. But this was different. Boiling had never been done before, not in this way. Vendors set up stalls to sell food. Crowds brought children. Local broadsheets circulated accounts of the poisoning. This was not justice. It was a macabre festival. Yet beneath the excitement was something darker: fear. Servants across the city were suddenly suspect. Cooks were watched more closely. Tensions rose in noble and clerical households. Roose's crime, real or imagined, had cracked the illusion of safety, and now everyone was looking over their shoulder. A king's fear becomes policy. To grasp the depth of King Henry VIII's response to the poisoning, we must step inside his mind, a mind shaped by betrayal, dynastic pressure, and an obsession with legacy. For Henry, trust was always provisional, and paranoia a kind of armor. The Roose incident ignited a primal fear that even within the walls of his realm, death could be stirred quietly into a bowl of soup. Roose's case may seem small compared to the sweeping decisions Henry made later, splitting from Rome, executing wives, dissolving monasteries, but this moment was pivotal. It offered Henry a rare opportunity to weaponize a moment of public outrage and cement his authority in a new, almost theatrical fashion. Boiling alive would not only punish, it would purify, terrify, and enthrone. The role of the Parliament, rubber stamp, or actor. It's tempting to see Parliament as a co-conspirator, but more often it was a terrified audience. Henry's presence in Parliament, unusual in itself, was a performance. His declaration that poisoning deserved a fate unheard of in our time set the stage. Lawmakers had no desire to oppose him. The act was drafted, reviewed, and passed with breathtaking speed. It didn't just criminalize poisoning, it elevated it to treason, placing it in the same category as rebelling against the king. But the punishment was novel, a thing of nightmares. And though few dared say it aloud, many must have wondered if a cook could be boiled, who might be next. Propaganda in punishment. The boiling law was not designed to endure. It was never applied broadly, but it didn't have to be. Its power lay in the image it painted: the state's willingness to inflict a death so terrible, so visceral, that it would be remembered forever. Executions in Tudor England were already gruesome: hanging, drawing, quartering, beheadings. But boiling introduced a slower horror of punishment in stages. It was the closest the state had come to performing a living autopsy, exposing the body and the soul before God and country. Commentary: fear as a language of governance. This was Henry's genius and his danger. He understood that law didn't need to be fair, just effective. And effectiveness meant fear. Centuries later, political theorists would describe this kind of rule as sovereign power, the right to make life and death decisions, to declare exceptions, to bend rules around a single body. In Henry's time, that body was his own, and Roose's body became the canvas. We often think of governance as documents, debates, institutions. But for much of human history, it was flesh. Henry ruled not only through edicts, but through blood and fire and spectacle. That's what makes the boiling of Richard Roose more than a footnote. It's a masterclass in medieval authoritarianism. The irony of innocence. One of the most haunting aspects of Roose's story is that he may not have understood what he had done. He claimed the powder was medicinal. Some chroniclers suggest he thought it a joke. And while that defense didn't stand under torture, it leaves us with uncomfortable ambiguity. What if the man boiled alive was not a murderer, but a fool? What if his execution wasn't just a punishment, but a misfire of justice wrapped in royal insecurity? Henry didn't care. The law was not about Roose. It was about making others watch. Inventing a punishment. The law that doomed Richard Roose didn't exist when he committed his crime. That is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his story. After the fact, Henry VIII created a new statute, Henry VIII, Chapter 9, that specifically named boiling as the punishment for poisoning. It was a legal mutation born out of fury and fear. This wasn't merely about strengthening justice, it was about reshaping the law into a tool of absolute rule. The statute served a singular purpose: to make an example of Roose. Once it had fulfilled that purpose, it was rarely used again. Retroactive laws are a hallmark of tyranny. They strip citizens of the assurance that their actions will be judged by established rules. With this act, Henry announced that no one was safe, not even in the boundaries of legality. The law could bend, mutate, or explode overnight. The mechanics of boiling, unlike hanging or beheading, was a punishment that unfolded over time. It required a large vessel heat that could be controlled and a crowd willing to watch. The suffering was prolonged. The body, once immersed, would blister, then flay. Limbs would twitch in agony. Voices would dissolve into inhuman wails. The boiling didn't kill instantly. It was a process. Sometimes the victim was lifted out and dropped in again so the crowd could see the torment. The skin would peel, the muscles would cook, and the smell of burning flesh would fill the square. This was justice not as retribution, but as performance. Every second was meant to sear fear into the onlookers. A singular sentence. Though the law remained on the books for over a decade, it was used sparingly. One other known case occurred in 1542 when a woman named Margaret Davy was boiled at Smithfield for allegedly poisoning her employers. But by the reign of Henry's son, Edward VI, the law was repealed. Even in a brutal age, boiling was seen as excessive. It was a symbol of unrestrained monarchy of laws written in rage. Its repeal was part of a broader attempt to reintroduce proportionality and rationality into the English justice system. But its shadow remained. Commentary justice and the theater of pain. The boiling law represents a moment when law and vengeance collided. It wasn't meant to protect the public, it was meant to terrify them. It was not about jurisprudence, it was about dominance. There's a term in political philosophy, exceptionalism. It refers to the power of the sovereign to declare a state of emergency and suspend the ordinary rules. That's what Henry did here. He suspended the legal norms and created a spectacle of suffering. And in doing so, he taught his subjects a brutal lesson, that mercy is a privilege, not a right. Modern societies may recoil from such cruelty, but the impulse to punish exceptionally in times of fear is still with us. Whether it's wartime internment, extraordinary rendition, or sweeping surveillance, modern states often use fear to justify suspending normal protections. The boiling law was not just a Tudor horror, it was a warning. Smithfield is a stage on April 5, 1531. Smithfield Square in London was transformed into something between a gallows and a theater. The execution of Richard Roose wasn't just state-sanctioned punishment, it was a choreographed event designed to horrify, to awe, and above all, to control. Crowds gathered early as they did for public executions, but this time anticipation was heightened by the novelty. A great bronze cauldron sat atop a roaring fire billowing steam. The smell of burning oak mingled with that of street vendors hawking beer bread and meat pies. Children clutched their mothers' hands. Local officials barked orders. The execution site resembled a festival, but its purpose was no celebration. The death of a man, the birth of a myth. When Roose was brought out bound and pale, witnesses said he looked more stunned than defiant. Some reports claim he was drunk, perhaps sedated with ale as an act of cruel mercy. Others say he trembled, whispering prayers. What is certain is this: he was stripped, lowered, and submerged. The screams were immediate. The first dip took his legs. His skin blistered and peeled. Onlookers gasped, some fainted. Others watched with a kind of fascinated horror and unable to look away. He was pulled up, then plunged in again, this time to his chest. Blood and tissue mixed with water. His cries became gurgles. By the third and final immersion, Roose was silent. His body slackened. What had begun as a punishment became a public trauma, a moment that branded itself onto the minds of all present. The audience effect. Why make executions public? Why turn punishment into theater? Tudor England operated on a principle as old as civilization itself. Fear is control. Seeing the pain inflicted on someone else, a real body, a real scream, served as the most visceral warning possible. No pamphlet or sermon could replicate the moral instruction of blood and fire. Roose's boiling took this logic to the extreme. This wasn't justice behind closed doors. This was a ritual meant to scare cooks, servants, conspirators, and the curious alike. And in doing so, it revealed just how fragile the line was between law and spectacle. Commentary: the power of spectacle. Throughout history, public executions have functioned as more than justice. They've been displays of state power, of religious purity, of social hierarchy. Whether it was crucifixions in Rome, burnings in medieval Europe, or lynchings in Jim Crow America, the purpose was the same: to remind the audience who held power and what defiance would cost. In Roose's case, the horror of boiling alive was calibrated to match the crime of poisoning itself, a secretive, cowardly act. The punishment, by contrast, was loud, violent, and public. It reversed the crime's nature. This inversion is the true genius and the true tragedy of such spectacles. They don't just punish the body, they redefine the meaning of guilt and control in the public imagination. And once a state realizes it can command obedience through horror, it's only a matter of time before horror becomes policy. History written in fear. Much of what we know about Richard Roose and his execution comes from a patchwork of sources: state records, ambassadorial letters, court documents, and chroniclers. Each account brings its own biases and agendas. And yet, through this imperfect mosaic, we can glimpse the tensions, the paranoia, and the performative brutality of the time. One of the most frequently cited accounts comes from Eustace Chapuys, the imperial ambassador to England. Chapuys was no neutral observer. He despised Anne Boleyn and was closely aligned with Queen Catherine's cause. Yet his writings offer detailed glimpses into court gossip and public sentiment. According to Chapuys, there were murmurs that Rose had been manipulated or used as a scapegoat to divert attention from darker intrigues surrounding Anne's rise. Chroniclers and contradictions. Tudor chroniclers like Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed wrote of Rose's crime and punishment, often emphasizing its horror and uniqueness. Hall, writing during Henry's reign, framed the event as a just and fitting punishment for a despicable act. His language is cold, clinical, and loyal to the crown. Holinshed writing later adds more color and doubt. He describes Rose as an unhappy wight and hints that the cook might have believed the powder harmless. In this telling, Rose becomes less a monster and more a man consumed by forces beyond his understanding. These conflicting tones reflect how public memory is shaped not by what happened, but by who tells the story and when. Silences in the records. Perhaps the most striking feature of the historical record is what's missing. There are no surviving statements from Rose himself except what was allegedly extracted under torture. No defense, no family testimony, no trial transcripts. He disappears from history as soon as he is condemned. This silence speaks volumes. It reminds us how the machinery of state violence erases not only bodies but also voices. Rose became a symbol, and symbols do not speak, they are spoken about. Commentary whose truth survives. The story of Richard Roose illustrates how history is less about facts and more about narratives. Each generation retells the story to suit its own moral, political, or emotional needs. To the Tudors, he was a traitor. To modern historians, perhaps a tragic fool. To us, he may be both a man caught in the gears of a dangerous time. The sources we rely on reflect the biases of the elite. Chapuys had royal allegiances. Hall was loyal to the regime. Holinshed tried to balance fact with drama. None of them knew Rose personally, and yet their voices are all we have. It's a reminder that when we read history, we must also read between the lines. Margaret Davy, the Forgotten Woman. A decade after Richard Rose's execution, another name briefly emerged from the darkness of Tudor justice, Margaret Davy. In 1542, she was boiled alive at Smithfield, the same location where Rose met his fate, her crime allegedly poisoning 3 separate households where she had been employed. Like Rose, Davy's personal details are sparse. She was likely a domestic servant, a woman with little social standing, vulnerable to both accusation and the cruelty of a system that saw her as expendable. The accusations claimed she used arsenic or other poisons to eliminate her masters. Whether for revenge gain or out of desperation, we will never know. The records focus on her punishment, not her life. The act of boiling Davy alive marked the second and final use of Henry VIII's boiling statute. After this, the law would be repealed. But her case, like Rose's, demonstrated how fragile one's fate could be when accused of a crime the monarchy deemed particularly insidious. Silenced and burned, Margaret Davy's execution received less fanfare than Rose's. It was recorded but not widely circulated. No ambassadors commented. No chroniclers lingered on her story. In many ways, she was swallowed by the machinery of punishment used as a footnote to validate a law already falling out of favor. Historians suggest that by 1542, even the Tudor elite had grown uncomfortable with boiling as punishment. It was too much, too raw, too uncontainable. The spectacle of a woman's body cooking in public may have triggered revulsion instead of fear. The gendered horror of boiling. In Margaret's case, gender complicates the horror. Public executions of women were already fraught with contradiction. Society expected women to be chaste, passive, and domestic. When they committed crimes, especially ones involving poison, it violated both legal codes and gender norms. To boil a woman alive was not only a statement of justice, but a perverse distortion of femininity. It shattered the image of domestic purity by turning the household servant into a national threat. And it did so in full view. Commentary when laws become tools of terror. The brief use of the boiling law reveals its purpose. It was never meant to be a long-term solution to crime. It was designed to shock, to burn a message into the minds of a population grappling with change and fear. Rose and Davy weren't high-profile traitors or political enemies. They were workers, cook and servant, accused of betrayal within the intimate space of the home. That made them perfect targets for a punishment that demanded visibility. In repealing the law shortly afterward, the monarchy seemed to acknowledge its excess. But the message had already been sent. Bodies had boiled. Fear had been sown. Bishop John Fisher, martyr of conscience. Though Richard Rose's alleged attempt on his life failed, Bishop John Fisher's defiance of royal authority eventually led him to the executioner's block. In 1535, just 4 years after the soup incident, Fisher was arrested and charged with treason for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England. Fisher's resistance wasn't political opportunism, it was theological conviction. He had long opposed the king's annulment in the break from Rome, and in doing so aligned himself with Queen Catherine and the Pope. Even in prison, he refused to recant. His execution on June 22, 1535, was public and symbolic. His head was displayed on London Bridge as a warning, later replaced by that of Sir Thomas More, who shared Fisher's fate for the same refusal. Fisher's death marked a turning point. With him gone, Henry's path to religious supremacy was clearer. But it came at the cost of spilling the blood of a man widely regarded, even by his enemies, as holy and incorruptible. Anne Boleyn, from queen to accused, Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry risked his kingdom and altered the nation's religion, did not escape the Tudor appetite for sacrifice. Just 5 years after Rose's boiling, she too faced an execution scaffold, this time for alleged adultery, incest, and treason. Her trial was a spectacle, her charges widely believed to be fabricated. Her fall from grace was swift and brutal, orchestrated by political enemies and a king who had grown disenchanted. On May 19, 1536, Anne was beheaded by a French swordsman at the Tower of London. The irony was thick. The woman who had risen as a symbol of change and ambition now fell as a scapegoat. Like Roseanne's body was destroyed to preserve the image of royal righteousness. Henry VIII, tyrant and architect Henry, outlived them all. His reign would stretch another 11 years after Anne's execution. He married 4 more women, dissolved the monasteries, and reformed the English church. But his paranoia deepened, his health declined, and his legacy darkened. What began as a king's desire for a male heir became a campaign of unrelenting control. From cooks to queens, no one was beyond his reach. His government grew more efficient, but also more lethal. Execution became routine. Mercy became myth. Henry died in 1547, obese, ill, and haunted. His break with Rome had changed England forever, but at immense human cost. The boiling of Richard Roose was one drop in that river of blood, but it was a drop that rippled far. Commentary when justice is personal. What ties together Rose Fisher, Anne, and even Henry himself is not merely historical sequence, but the collapse of public and private justice. Decisions were made not from impartial legal systems, but from personal vendettas, fears, and desires. Roose was punished for a crime he may not have understood. Fisher was killed for his principles. Anne was executed for being inconvenient. And Henry ruled with a fear so consuming it rewrote law, church, and history. Tudor England offers us a lesson still relevant today. When the law serves the ruler instead of the people, everyone is vulnerable, even those closest to the throne. From forgotten to symbolic. Richard Roose lived as an invisible man but died as a symbol. For centuries, his name barely registered in the grand narrative of Tudor history. He wasn't a noble, a cleric, or a knight, just a cook. And yet his death by boiling is one of the most gruesome executions recorded in English legal history. It is not just the manner of his death that keeps his memory alive, but what it represents. Roose is a reminder of how easily a person can be crushed under the weight of politics and fear. A man whose job was to feed others became the main ingredient in a recipe for royal terror. The unmarked site, the lingering memory Smithfield. The place where Roose died is now a bustling commercial area. Offices and shops line streets once soaked in the spectacle of public punishment. No plaque marks the spot where the cauldron boiled. No statue honors the lives lost in service or silence. But memory doesn't need monuments to survive. The story of Roose reemerges in every discussion of historical injustice, of tyrannical law, and of the human cost of unchecked power. His death echoes as a parable not just of cruelty, but of how fear can reshape a society's values. Lessons from the past. Roose's case offers modern readers a prism through which to examine the fragility of justice. When punishment is driven by spectacle, when guilt is presumed before trial, and when law is molded by emotion rather than principle, the result is not order but terror. We might think ourselves beyond the world of boiling cauldrons and public dismemberments, but the temptation to use fear as a tool of governance persists. The tools have changed: surveillance, incarceration, media manipulation, but the dynamic remains: leaders manufacturing threats to justify extraordinary power. Commentary: the cost of being forgotten. Perhaps the most tragic element of Richard Roose's story is that he nearly disappeared. not because no one cared, but because he wasn't important enough to remember. He had no wealth, no allies, no legacy to protect him. And yet, in his suffering, he speaks volumes. His death is a cautionary tale about what happens when individuals become pawns, when justice is used to perform dominance rather than pursue truth. We remember Richard Roose not because he was powerful, but because he wasn't. His story reminds us that real justice must apply equally to kings and cooks alike. Retribution versus reform. The case of Richard Roose forces us to confront the core question at the heart of any justice system: is punishment about revenge, or is it about rehabilitation? In Roose's time, the answer was clear. Punishment was about fear, power, and retribution. Boiling a man alive was not about justice. It was about performance, deterrence, and dominance. Modern legal systems claim to have moved beyond such brutality. But have they really? While we no longer boil people alive, many nations still struggle with disproportionate sentencing, inhumane prison conditions, and the persistence of capital punishment. The ethics of punishment remain deeply contested. Cruelty in context. To understand Tudor executions, we must view them in their historical context. In an age with no centralized police force, no professional investigators, and limited scientific evidence, justice was often swift and public. The state needed to demonstrate authority in visible ways. Pain and spectacle were part of the equation. Yet cruelty doesn't age well. As societies evolve, they tend to look back in horror at the violence once considered normal. What is unthinkable now was policy then, and what we now accept as necessary might one day be considered barbaric. The modern mirror. Look closely at Roose's execution, and you'll find reflections of modern dilemmas. Governments invoking national security to suspend civil liberties, media-fueled trials that preclude fair judgment, and legal loopholes that prioritize symbolism over justice. Mass incarceration, systemic bias, and politicized justice are today's version of the boiling pot. They may not burn the skin, but they sear the soul and leave countless lives scarred by a system more concerned with control than correction. Commentary. What justice demands? Justice at its best is a balance protecting society while preserving humanity. It recognizes that punishment must fit the crime not just in scope but in spirit. The story of Richard Roose warns us against allowing vengeance to masquerade as law. The ethics of punishment must include humility, a willingness to admit when systems fail, when fear drives decisions, and when the desire to appear strong overrides the need to be just. It must include compassion, even for those who transgress. The boiling of Richard Roose is not merely a relic of the past, it is a cautionary echo, a warning that the line between justice and cruelty is always thinner than we think. Conclusion. Centuries later, Roose's screams are no longer heard, but his story still speaks. It reminds us that civilization is not defined by its laws, but by how it chooses to enforce them.